As U.S. banks report tens of billions of dollars in profits in the last quarter, millions of Americans are still at risk of losing their homes. What's behind the persistent housing crisis more than 6 years after it began? You're watching Inside Story US 2012 from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. 4 years ago, the US government spent hundreds of billions in taxpayer money to shore up a financial system on the brink of collapse. Today, the largest banks in the country have seen quarter after quarter of rising profits. Meanwhile, around 30% of US homeowners with a mortgage owe more on their loan than their home is worth. Many of them live in the swing states, which will determine who will win the 2012 election. While campaigning in 2008, Barack Obama promised to help those facing foreclosure. But as president, he's only supported limited programs providing lenders incentives to restructure troubled mortgages. As Faultline's Josh Rushing found out, in the absence of an effective plan to tackle the housing crisis, some have taken matters into their own hands.
Vacant properties are spreading like wildfire through Chicago's poor neighborhoods. The city plans to tear some of them down to reduce blight. But the Chicago anti-eviction campaign and the Take Back the Land movement have been trying to identify and clean up some of these homes and make them livable again.
I'm trying to get a team out here tonight to look at the plumbing. We know we need 2 kitchen sets.
Today, they're targeting this foreclosed house in Chicago's South Side.
That's still good. This is why I hate evictions. People just being forced to take what they could, you know, and not what they should.
This family was evicted. They left so fast that they didn't even take all these letters with them and all these pictures that were left behind. Really remnants of a life.
And so you have all of these empty houses in the midst of a large population that has real need for decent housing. And you cannot put the two together because the income stream they have is not sufficient to satisfy the banks on the housing. It's at moments like this when the irrationality of the whole capitalist system becomes, perfectly obvious. So you then start to say, well, maybe we have to really think about a completely different system.
Everyone should have a roof over their head. And so when we take over foreclosed and abandoned property, we're saying we're recreating public housing.
We got in touch with a family that was evicted from here.
They love the, big backyard. We don't have.
Kenya Perkins and her 3 children agreed to meet us the next day back at their old home.
I miss my own room. Yeah, I miss my own too. It's basically the same, really. It's just, I wish I could have stayed.
Kenya had been renting the property, but was locked out when the building was foreclosed upon.
Feels like home.
What was the hardest part of it?
Figuring out where I was going to go, where my kids was going to sleep the next day. So it was a bit much.
Yeah.
I'm just grateful God put me through it.
Why is that?
Everything happened all at the same time. They lost their grandmother, and we lost the apartment. So it was like a rough time in our life for that to, come down on us as well, a bit much.
Kenya's story isn't unusual. Nationwide, 40% of families facing eviction due to foreclosures are renters. The anti-eviction campaign hopes to make Kenya's old home available to a homeless family.
The banks have taken away so much from people that it's about time that the people take something from the bank.
Moving families into bank-owned foreclosed homes is a creative response to the crisis, but it could put the activists on a collision course with the law.
it was illegal for blacks and whites to eat together, to dine together, to sit together, to walk together, to talk together. But it was something that was morally right. So people tell us it's illegal for us to occupy our homes. It's illegal for us to take back the land. They're right, it is illegal, but it's morally right.
And you can watch For Sale, The American Dream, on Tuesday at 22:30 GMT, that's 6:30 p.m. Eastern, and again on Wednesday at 09:30 GMT, 5:30 a.m. Eastern. So, can some of the more innovative ideas to fix the housing crisis succeed without significant government support? To discuss this, we're joined from New York by Cathy Albisa. She's the co-founder of the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative. Here in the studio, we have Robert Hockett. He's a law professor at Cornell University. And by Max Rameau, co-founder of the Take Back the Land movement. Before we get to that stage, though, Cathy, are we seeing coherent policies being set forth by both candidates in this current election cycle as to how to solve this problem, do you think?
We're not. In fact, there's a surprising dearth of conversation regarding a crisis that's this deep and this wide. And, you know, what I'd like to put out there to start is that we don't have a housing crisis. Unlike other countries that don't have enough housing for their people, we have more than enough housing. We have 3 times as many empty homes as homeless people. We've had a building boom. Housing stock is not our problem. We have a human rights crisis and a political crisis that leads to this unwillingness to address the problem at its root cause.
It's interesting. We had a speaker in Josh Rushing's documentary there talking about the irrationality, perhaps, of not dealing with these problems. And in fact, I mean, clearly, this is going to be have an impact on the forthcoming election. 5 out of the 10 states with the highest foreclosure rates are swing states. Nevada, Florida, Ohio, Michigan, and Colorado have foreclosure rates that are among the highest in that nation. In Nevada, 1 in every 307 homes was in foreclosure during the first part of 2012. There are nearly 340,000 underwater mortgages. That means more than 600,000 eligible voters in Nevada that owe more than their home is worth. 1 out of every 508 homes in Ohio was in foreclosure between January and June of 2012. There are over 500,000 mortgages that are worth more than the current home value. That makes up more than 1 million eligible voters. The percentages are so important for each candidate, and yet, Max, I mean, are you impressed? Are you hearing any discussion about this? Do you know what Mitt Romney's position really is on this topic, for example?
I don't know what Mitt Romney's position is, and we have some idea of what Obama's position is. However, it doesn't seem to be very effective and very proactive. I think what's more important and what has proven more important in social movements in the way that we've made significant advancements in this country is not what the elected officials promise to do or the politicians promise to do for us, but it's what program we can put together ourselves and put forward and compel those who are running for office and those who are vying for votes, what we can compel them to agree to and compel them to do.
We'll look at some of those strategies in more detail a little later in the program. But Professor, again, to go back to this idea of irrationality, isn't it actually in the long-term interest of both parties, not just purely because of the election cycle, but even for the health of the country to solve this, even for the donors for these political parties to be rather keen on solving this problem?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And actually, it's in the interest of the creditors themselves, right? The people who are owed on these mortgages that are denominated at higher rates than the prices, than the houses themselves are worth right now. It's actually in the interest of the lenders themselves, right, to see significant principal write-downs on these underwater mortgage loans. The problem is that there are a lot of structural impediments to those changes actually being made, changes that indeed, again, would be benefiting the creditors as well as the debtors. And it goes without saying, I suppose, then it would benefit the rest of the country as well, because the single heaviest drag on economic recovery right now still is this ongoing debt crisis. I agree with Cathy, it's not a housing crisis at all. It is a human rights crisis, it's various forms of crisis, but it is also a debt crisis on a huge scale, a scale that we haven't seen for about 70 or 80 years in this country.
And how central to the US's economic problems is this, would you say?
I would say it is the core issue. It is at the very core of the ongoing economic problems. The reason is because, of course, when you've got this many Americans so heavily indebted, right, owing more on their homes than the homes are actually market value, valued, what they're worth right now. They don't spend in the way that they would have done, right? They don't engage in consumer spending of the kind that is the principal driver of economic growth and employment in this country. So as long as you have this debt overhang, to the degree that we have it, you're not going to have enough consumer spending to keep the economy growing at more than an anemic rate and to keep the employment rates high enough, right? So that's why people are hurting and don't have jobs in addition to not having homes.
Cathy, were you about to say something?
Right, yeah, I was. I also, we have to think about how we got ourselves into this debt crisis. I think we've gone from, in the late 80s, something like $40,000 in debt per family in the country to something like 100. That's more than double. And speculative housing was a huge part of that. We're treating housing not only like a commodity, but like a commodity that we gamble with.
And as a substitute,
we're not
right?
treating it like the foundation of community stability, which in fact it is.
All right, well, I mean, what's so perplexing, I suppose, is that President Obama clearly recognized this was a problem. Here's what he had to say about the issue during his State of the Union address.
Responsible homeowners shouldn't have to sit and wait for the housing market to hit bottom to get some relief. And that's why I'm sending this Congress a plan that gives every responsible homeowner the chance to save about $3,000 a year on their mortgage by refinancing at historically low rates. No more red tape, no more runaround from the banks.
Cathy, clearly then, that sounds like a step in the right direction, doesn't it? I mean, what happened to all of these different projects, these different initiatives announced by the government?
Well, I think they were trying to reach about 9 million homeowners, ended up reaching about 2, but the whole premise is still inadequate. We're talking about reducing interest when in fact the homes they have more debt than what they're worth. Principal reduction is going to be necessary, but even that's not sufficient. We have to rethink how our housing market works and whether in fact it should be purely a market, given the kind of havoc it has wreaked on the American people, structured as it is. This crisis is going to affect 1 in 5 existing mortgages. 1 in 3 families are in unstable housing situations right now. 50% of renters are burdened. It is a huge crisis that is structural in nature, and to sort of tinker with interest rates is a good thing for the families you can help, but it's inadequate. And the administration is only part of a problem. It's the entire political establishment that has been unwilling to see the magnitude of this crisis and to acknowledge the harm that it's causing. And Max is right, the solutions are going to have to come from movements and communities that are going to push harder, or have to push harder, for more serious change.
As we look at President Obama's record, though, Professor, it did seem while he was campaigning and before he became president, he was in favor, again, not of entirely changing the housing system as we know it, but at least of mitigating things in a serious matter, mitigating mortgages and so forth. And even that didn't really come to pass. So, for example, changing bankruptcy laws or other proposals that were being discussed quite seriously. What happened?
Well, I guess a number of problems, right? So first of all, I mean, there was, I think, a tendency at the beginning not to realize quite how serious the problem was. And so there seems to have been a thought that, well, if we sort of tinker around the edges a bit, if we change the interest rates or if we extend the terms of the loans so that the buyers or the homeowners can be paying over a longer period of time, then they can make smaller monthly payments, that will do the job. But it won't, right? Because everybody seems to realize, I mean, all the economists at least seem to realize that you've really got to address principal reduction above all else, right? As long as people owe more on these homes, and indeed significantly more on these homes than the homes themselves are worth now, you're just not going to solve the problem. You're making it easier for them to get by, but they are living in the shadow of heavy debt loads, and there's no end in sight, right, to living under the shadow of those heavy debt loads. So the first problem, I think, was that principal reduction was not taken seriously enough at the front end.
Was that because they were fearing moral hazard and this idea that it would be unfair to help people?
I think that's part of the concern, right? There seems to have been a kind of caution on the part of the administration that,
because talking about moral hazard when talking about banks is quite interesting anyway.
Which is quite intriguing, right? Yeah. Yes. And when you're looking at corporate bankruptcies, when firms go bankrupt, we always look for rational solutions, right? We write down the debt, we render it more manageable, and when you do that, of course, you actually benefit the creditor and the debtor alike. And when the creditor and the debtor are both firms, corporations of some kind, we don't have any qualms at all about doing that. But for some reason, we seem to have all sorts of concerns about doing that on behalf of homeowners.
Well, let me say that addressing the amount of principal that people owe is an important component to this whole situation. But it is only one component. In the very powerful short film we just saw dealing with the family with the Chicago anti-eviction campaign, campaign. The woman there was evicted from her home, but she wasn't a homeowner. She doesn't qualify for principal reduction.
Right.
Principal reduction would have no impact on her whatsoever. The reality is there's never been in the history of the United States more than 49% of the black community who has had a mortgage, who has lived in a house that they own. So even if we were somehow magically to get every single person who had a mortgage to get a significant write-down on their mortgage, even so that it still would not help the majority of certain communities.
Is foreclosed tenancy even on the radar then?
Foreclosed, I don't see foreclosed
And
tenancy here at all.
Sorry, Cathy, go ahead.
You know, I wanted to add something that I think we also need to be watching, which is these bulk sales of homes that are now vacant and foreclosed to large developers. The conversation now is whether the federal government is going to sell at sharply reduced rates all these foreclosed homes to large real estate developers. Now, we have been talking about for several years now in this country how we have a problem of wealth concentration, yet the solution being put out there for blight is not giving the community an opportunity to rehabilitate those homes and sort of create community ownership over them, but rather to sell them to large developers who obviously want to invest to make a huge profit off of renting in the future. So if we're going to be moving towards a much larger sector of housing being rental housing, nothing we do around the mortgage crisis is going to be able to protect those people who may be, you know, equally exploited by this new system that's emerging.
But when did the interests of the lender and the interests of the borrower diverge to this extent? I mean, isn't that partly the problem?
I actually don't think it's that. I don't think that's the problem. I think that the interests of the lender and the borrower actually converge a great deal more than people seem to realize, and it's actually people in between those two parties that are really responsible, right? So if you look at the terms of the securitization agreements pursuant to which a lot of the securitized mortgage loans were pooled and then securitized, they actually prevent, in many cases, the servicers from selling off the underperforming loans or from restructuring, including writing down principal on those loans. And that would actually be in the interest of the bondholders themselves, who are the ultimate creditors in a case like this.
Right, so I suppose what I meant was the person who actually was nominally buying the house, rather, and their interests. When did those diverge so greatly from the issue of the loan in the first place?
From this, I really don't know. I mean, I don't know that they've. Right. I don't know exactly that they did diverge. You know, a lot of the troubled mortgages that we're talking about are securitized, and that means in turn that they are owned by multiple people, including lots of pensioners, including public pensioners, right? So firemen and police officers out in California who participate in CalPERS. CalPERS, of course, invests in these mortgage-backed securities, and so in a certain sense, the ultimate creditors, in many cases, are themselves small fry as well. Right. The problem is the larger institutions that did the securitizing, that structured these deals in the first place, that put the particular contracts together, that ultimately gave rise to the bonds that the bondholders hold on the one hand, and that enabled the credit at first to flow cheaply to the homeowners on the other hand. That's, I think, where the problem lies. The people who actually drafted these contracts, put together these securitization deals, in many cases don't seem to have had any eye to the future or to the long-term interests of those long-term creditors or those long-term borrowers.
So what is the way back, Max?
I think that while that is a particular kind of problem inside of the context of home ownership and markets, I do think that there is some divergence of interest here. Where the homeowner supposedly, in most instances, wants a place to live, and the creditors wants to maximize their profit. And to the extent that the homeowner can no longer provide a good source of profit for the creditor, then their interests are completely unaligned. And that's why, in the context of housing being a commodity, just like any other commodity, then there really is a divergence of interest. And the only way to get those interests back in line, or at least make the divergence of interest not so brutal.
So how do we do that? Let's get on to that.
Is by elevating housing to the level of a human right. If human beings have a right to housing, regardless of
practically, what would that mean?
I think practically that would mean that the laws would have to be restructured so that they protect human beings and their right to stay in places rather than banks and their right to keep empty. Right now, in cities all across the United States, police are mobilizing and they are defending and they are blockading and they are arresting people who try to get into empty homes and kicking people out of the homes, rather than the police being mobilized to defend people and their right to stay in homes versus the banks who are trying to get them out.
But Cathy, I mean, you talk about changing the whole the structural nature of the housing market in the United States, or indeed generally in capitalism, I suppose. I mean, is that really on the agenda, do you think, right now?
Well, look, we have to ask ourselves, what is housing for? If it is purely an investment, that's going to lead to one set of policies. If it's to create stable communities, to protect families, that's going to create another set of policies. If you look at what's happening with the settlement that the AGs entered into, a lot of that money is actually being used to demolish empty homes. And the reasoning behind it is that it would eliminate blight and keep market values up in surrounding areas. Now, if the goal is to keep market values up rather than to keep people housed, you're going to have a different set of policies. You're going to start bulldozing places rather than thinking, what's the best way we can use these homes? Who needs these homes? How can we rehabilitate them if they're needed, if that's important, to get families back in there? But the goal doesn't seem to be housing. The goal seems to be keeping investments at a certain level.
I mean, Professor, does that mean that the whole theory that housing was some sort of vehicle for social mobility is completely flawed, though? I mean, because banks and other institutions can't be trusted to not try and make the most money out of that concept, basically.
I don't think it had to be flawed, but there were structural problems, I think, that Cathy pointed to earlier that played an important role here, right? We've had declining or stagnating real incomes and wages for over 30 years in this country, and in consequence, policymakers relied on artificially inflated housing prices as a sort of substitute, right? They called it the wealth effect, you might recall. And the idea was that, well, insofar as people aren't making as much money as they used to, they can still maintain purchasing power essentially by borrowing against the rising equity in their homes, right? So they converted their homes into ATM machines, in effect. And all of the operative policies at least, encouraged, at least didn't discourage, and in many cases encouraged that reliance on housing prices, inflating housing prices as a substitute for wealth.
Surely there's a reckoning now that this doesn't work, but I'm not hearing this discussion, though, so except for here.
Right. So you mean there's a recognition that won't work?
Exactly.
Right?
It's time to look at radical new alternatives.
I think, yeah, there are two, and I'll turn it over to Max in a second, but there's sort of a shorter term and a longer term. Right? The shorter term, we simply have to cut principal back down to the prices. The only way to eliminate the debt overhang is either to reflate the housing prices, which we can't do, right? That would mean bringing back the bubble, or to trim the debt. That's the only alternative. So we have to get serious about principal reduction, first of all, as sort of a short-term matter. And then as far as a longer-term matter is concerned, we really do have to look very seriously at the distribution of wealth and income in this country and the many, many policies that determine that distribution, right? Because we really are converting from a country that used to have a vast middle class that was growing, and the American dream was for everybody who wasn't in the middle class to be able to get into it. And now we've got essentially a huge and growing underclass and a very small upper class.
Right, well, most of our discussions seem to end up with this, especially
and the
on US
administration is...
Yeah, go ahead.
And the administration is running in the opposite direction right now with these huge bulk sales. Because if you're going to be selling hundreds of thousands of homes to a few investors, you're obviously not dealing with this need to rebuild the middle class.
Right.
Max.
And
I
to
think
not only address the chronic poverty we've had, but to bring people back into the middle class who've now fallen into poverty.
I think this is right, that the whole idea that housing is somehow a way of increasing your income or a means of social mobility is fraudulent. And if that's true, then the whole discussion about principal reduction is entirely besides the point. If that model doesn't work, then reducing principal is only going to reset in the short term or the long term. Right. If all it's going to do is going to reset the cards, then this really is shifting chairs on the Titanic or changing wallpaper on your underwater housing. If
but again, it's I suppose that usual point, though, that the income inequality in the end is the major problem in the U.S. economy right now, and no one is dealing with it. Professor, I go back to what that chap said in Josh's piece, though, the irrationality of capitalism. Isn't basically, this is going down, basically, isn't it? The system is...
Yeah, I think it's long been recognized by economists, orthodox and unorthodox, that there certainly are significant irrationalities at the core of a capitalist system. The real question is whether they can be rectified, whether you can fine-tune a capitalist system to make it work in a functional way or not. And that's an ongoing debate, right? There's the people of the sort of Marxian persuasion who think, well, it's just simply impossible to repair it. It's so fundamentally flawed. And of course, David Harvey, who was quoted before, is one of those. There are other people of a slightly less radical persuasion, but still relatively radical, who follow, say, John Maynard Keynes, who recognize that there are fundamental irrationalities at the core, and that you might be able to at least address those. But Keynes left that question open. At the very end of the general theory, he said it might be that in the end we have to socialize investment. And he might have been right, but that's the jury's still out on that, at least in my book. I know a lot of people, though, for a lot of people that's already been decided.
socializing investment or not, I think it's pretty clear that housing as an investment hasn't worked and is not working. And I think this society, one of the great challenges for this society and this generation is going to be to decide once and for all, what is the fundamental purpose of housing? Is it to provide homes for human beings, or is it to provide investment income for bankers and for other people? And until we resolve that question, I think we're just going to be repeating these problems.
Max Rameau, thank you very much. Professor Robert Hockett, thank you. Cathy Albisa, thank you as well, team. And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.